My family humiliated me and my daughter at Thanksgiving, but that was the night I uncovered their darkest secret. Why are you doing this, Mother? Evelyn Carter's voice quivered with suppressed wrath as she spoke. The rich aroma of freshly baked bread and roasted turkey filled the air as the large dining room was illuminated by warm candlelight. Evelyn and her 10-year-old daughter, Luna, did not attend the festivities. They sat apart from the family at a small, fragile table in the corner of the room. Fine silverware and crystal glasses decorated the center's magnificent oak table. Meanwhile, they were served 2 servings of cold, lumpy mashed potatoes. Coldly elegant. Margaret Carter, Evelyn's mother, simply grinned and sipped her wine. Think of it as a lesson, my darling. Some people do not belong at the main table. Hello, cherished readers. Today, I have a captivating story that will keep you captivated, brimming with mystery, deceit, and a horrifying family secret. Have you ever felt estranged inside your family? Imagine uncovering a terrifying secret that has remained hidden for generations. Tonight, we uncover the strange story of Evelyn Carter, a woman never fully embraced by her own mother. However, this is more than just a story about neglect. It also involves secrets, retaliation, and an unforgiving curse. Do you have the bravery to find out? Let's get started. Evelyn felt a shudder go down her back. She'd endured this treatment her entire life. Margaret had, however, drawn Luna into it. That was an error. A tremendous mistake. Pushpin Chapter 1: A Startling Betrayal at Thanksgiving. The polished silverware and crystal glasses reflected the warm golden light from the large chandelier above the dining room. The aroma of caramelized yams, spicy cranberry sauce, and roasting turkey filled the air. With one exception, the Thanksgiving scene was perfect. The big table was empty of Evelyn Carter and her daughter Luna, age 10. Tucked up at the doorway like stray guests, they sat at a small, rickety side table. The matriarch of the family, Margaret Carter, attracted Evelyn's attention as she glanced across the room, beyond the beautiful tablecloths and the clinking of fine china. Mom. Margaret lifted her glass in salute as she sat at the head of the large oak table. She looked exquisite, royal, and completely unaware of the 2 people she had just degraded in public. Luna's tiny fingers gripped the edge of her chair as she writhed uneasily beside her mother. Mom, why are we sitting here? She said in a low, bewildered voice. The bitterness surged in Evelyn's throat, but she swallowed it. It was what she had anticipated. She was aware that the invitation was not meant to be kind. It was a strategic move. A reminder that she was lower than even the slaves and behind her sister in the Carter family hierarchy. Margaret set down her wine glass and gave Evelyn a gentle smile. Some people belong at the main table, dear, she replied gently, and some, well, they should be grateful they're invited at all. Disdainful laughter echoed around the table. As her husband whispered something in her ear, Evelyn saw her sister, Anna, grin behind her napkin. Even family friends looked at each other with amusement. Evelyn, however, would not turn away. Feeling the cold steel of Margaret Carter's painstakingly constructed cruelty, she maintained her mother's gaze. This was what she had endured for 32 years. The comments were patronizing. Bias exists. Margaret used subtle but deliberate tactics to make her feel invisible. However, this time, her daughter was observing this moment. Evelyn felt something snap inside. The cold dish. The food was brought out by the waitresses. A tray of creamy mashed potatoes, deep brown gravy, and cooked turkey was presented to each visitor. Aside from Luna and Evelyn, their platters were cold, late, and distinctly different in appearance. They were given weak green beans and a lump of flavorless mashed potatoes in place of turkey. Luna scowled. Mom, why is our food cold? The whole table fell silent. Margaret, unfazed, used a napkin to wipe the corner of her mouth. Oh dear, she said with a smile, it must have been out too long. However, you're aware that we had to service our most important guests first. Evelyn felt the words pierce her like a knife. Although Luna's bottom lip trembled, Evelyn saw embarrassment in her daughter's eyes. And Evelyn felt angry for the first time in her life. A slow-burning anger that didn't need to be begged or wept. No. Plots were inspired by this kind of rage. This was the sort of anger that waited for the ideal opportunity to manifest itself. She grabbed her fork and stabbed into the cold, solidified potatoes, then chewed on one. She chewed slowly, consciously. Then she smiled. The initial action. "Come on, sweetheart," Evelyn said in a charming whisper as she placed her napkin on the table. Luna gave a blink. "But Mom, we haven't even. This is our last stop." Evelyn got up, took her daughter's hand, and turned to leave. The air was filled with a series of murmurs. Puzzled, Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Dear, are you heading out right now? You were always too emotional." "How dramatic." Evelyn remained silent. Rather, she turned, for a minute only, as she got to the doorway. She refrained from glaring. She didn't yell. She just smiled. Margaret Carter's chair twitched uneasily. She wasn't sure if she had won the round for the first time. The Diary in the Walls, Chapter 2. It had always felt cold in the Carter house. The coldness in the Carter house was not solely due to the November air that seeps through its ancient walls, but rather to a deeper, more profound, and intangible force. The silence pressed against Evelyn's ears as she lay awake in her childhood bedroom, gazing at the ceiling. Tonight was the ultimate turning point. The humiliation during dinner, which her daughter Luna dismissed as if she didn't exist, had reached a breaking point for her. She rolled over and rubbed her fingertips over the old wooden nightstand's chipped and aged surface. Abruptly, she sensed it. There was a slight breeze. Not possible. No windows were open. She trailed her fingertips over the wall behind the nightstand, her breathing becoming more rapid. To her touch, the wallpaper seemed frail and flaking. Behind it, there was a faint trace of a rather loose wooden panel. Her heartbeat accelerated. She hesitated. This felt wrong in some way. Like it was just waiting for her to find it. However, she overcame her hesitancy and tugged on the panel. There was a disconcerting creak when it came off. Inside was a small leather-bound book, obscured by shadow and dust. To reveal the aged gold letters on the cover, Evelyn cleaned it. Margaret Carter, 1962. She found her mother's childhood diary. She turned the first page, her fingers shaking. The words were incisive and purposeful, like chiseled confessions, but the ink had faded. "She watches over me as I sleep, November 12th, 1962. I am aware that she is still present." Evelyn scowled. Who was she? She threw herself forward. "I told Mother about the muttering on December 3rd, 1962. She gave me a slap. She warned me not to bring up her name ever again." Evelyn felt a dryness in her throat. Did her mother write a piece on her? Was it written by Evelyn's grandmother? She flipped the page. Her heart ceased beating. The darker ink was pressed onto the page nearly violently. The statement reads, "January 5th, 1963, I do not want it. I never wanted it. Mother said if I don't get rid of it, it will bring ruin to us all." What? She scrolled down the page, her heart pounding. "I told her that I was unable to, that I wouldn't. She called me a fool. She assured me that I would comprehend eventually." What do you comprehend? Evelyn turned swiftly to the next page. "January 14th, 1963, I was wrong. I ought to have listened. The nightmares won't stop. She is on her way to get me." She drew a deep breath. She turned the final page. The handwriting was erratic, hurried, and almost incomprehensible. Evelyn should never have been born. The book fell from her grasp. She looked at the words, gasping for air. There was more to this than mere childish babble. Margaret, her mother, never desired her. She wasn't meant to be there. The walls pressed inward, making the room seem smaller. Evelyn's mind was whirling. She had always been aware that she was her ideal sister Anna's inferior daughter and the unwanted child. However, there was more to this. This was prearranged. She tried to breathe through the nausea while closing her eyes. It had to be a mistake. A miscommunication. But she knew the truth in her heart. She had always been seen by Margaret as an issue that needed to be resolved. Because, as her mother says, she was precisely that. A hard knock broke the silence. The diary lay open on the floor as Evelyn leaped. She walked over to the door. One more knock. It was louder this time. Her chest tightened. Who would knock at this hour? Carefully, she got up from the floor and walked to the door. Every time she moved, the wooden boards creaked under her feet. She touched the knob with her hand. Stopped. There was a problem. The air seemed to be on the verge of a storm, thicker and more agitated. She turned back to the journal. The pages fluttered, even though there was no breeze. Once more, the knock came from within the room. Evelyn had very cold blood. Her heart thumping, she whirled around. Nothing. The faint light from the bedside lamp was swallowed up by the shadows that extended along the wall. The knocking has ceased. A single whisper passed over her eardrum in the quiet. You were never supposed to be here. Pushpin of Family Secret in Chapter 3, Ink Buried. Evelyn Carter's hands shook as she glanced over the beautiful, yellowed pages of her ancient leather-bound diary. She shuddered as she noticed the name embossed on the cover. Margaret Carter, 1962. She found her mother's notebook from her childhood. As she carefully flipped the fragile pages, an unusual sensation crept up her neck. The words were still sharp as blades, even though the ink had faded over time. The entries first appeared to be typical. Simple insights from the life of a young girl. Mother says I should always sit straight at dinner and never speak unless spoken to. Today, Father brought home a new radio. I love how it crackles when he rotates the clock. However, the tone changed toward the midpoint of the novel. The handwriting became uneven and frenzied, as if composed in panic. Evelyn's breath caught as she read the words that followed. I am not interested in it. I never desire it. She said if I don't get rid of it, it will bring ruin to us all. At night, I hear it wailing. I cover my ears, yet the roar remains. Evelyn felt her heart racing. To whom was she referring? She switched to a new page. I followed her instructions. I made an effort. However, it still exists. I loathe it. I despised it. Because the ink had smudged, it appeared that someone had scrawled those phrases while crying. As Evelyn reached the final pages, a cold perspiration streamed down her face. Then, she realized her name. One line drawn with precise, crisp strokes. We never intended for Evelyn to be born. She felt knots in her stomach. Her fingers squeezed the pages until the edges nearly ripped. Even though every part of her shouted out for her to stop reading, she forced herself to keep on. Grandma was right. She will ruin me if I let her live. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She had scared her mother, Margaret. However, why? With her heart pounding, she turned the page once more. However, the rest of the book was blank, as if her mother had stopped writing altogether after that entry. No, it could not finish there. There must have been more. Her hands frantically flipped to the final page of the diary. There, written in a faint, almost ghostly ink, were the final words. The cycle cannot be broken. Evelyn's vision blurred as she looked at the words. What's the cycle? Did her mother's animosity for her arise from this? Was she always handled as if she were an unwanted burden? Is this why Margaret is still striving to remove her from the family? Her chest tightened with tremendous, boiling hatred. Her mother had never adored her, and she had always wondered why. She had responded. Love had never been the topic. Fear had been an issue. Margaret tried to get rid of her before she was born. When it didn't work, she attempted to push Evelyn away and make her disappear for the remainder of her childhood. However, she had failed. Margaret would now have to face the reality. As Evelyn closed the diary, her fingers grabbed the leather cover tightly. Was she regarded as a curse by her mother? All right, she was going to become one. Pushpin, a masterful revengee in Chapter 4. Margaret Carter had always commanded her family, her home, and, most importantly, her reputation. However, Evelyn discovered something vital in her childhood bedroom that evening. It is possible to break even the most resilient mind. And she would demonstrate it. She refused to yell. She declined to fight. No, Evelyn's proposal was way better. It started at breakfast the next morning. Margaret took her normal position at the head of the fine dinner table. In the delicate chandelier light, her pearl necklace shone. Evelyn, across from her, placed something lightly on the glistening wood. A torn leather book. Margaret paused. She was completely aware of what it was. Evelyn noticed something weird in her mother's face for the first time in her life. Fear. Where did you find this? Margaret's fingers twitched slightly as she reached for the diary, and her voice seemed strained. Evelyn sipped her coffee gently, smirking. It found me. Margaret swallowed hard, causing her throat to bob. She breathed shallowly as she turned the pages. The clinking of cutlery from the other guests at the table faded to a low hum as the room fell silent. Evelyn could hear her mother's heart hammering against her ribs. We never intended for Evelyn to be born. Margaret swiftly raised her eyes to meet hers. Evelyn did not turn her head. Margaret did not either. Margaret was unable to gaze down on her daughter for the first time in her life. For the first time, she understood Evelyn was stronger. She was terrified by that. The actual game began that evening. Margaret did not attend the meal. She closed the drapes and sequestered herself in her study. Walter asked about her well-being. She lied, saying, just a headache. However, Evelyn was wiser. In the days that followed, things began to change. Margaret would flinch if she heard an abrupt noise. Even when she was alone, she looked over her shoulder. Evelyn strolled by her mother's room one night at 2 a.m. and the light was still on. She grinned. All right. Allow her to miss her sleep. Margaret appeared pallid the next morning. Her meticulously maintained hair appeared unnatural, and her usual piercing sharpness had faded when she spoke. She whispered, "Evelyn," at breakfast. Evelyn raised her eyebrow. "Yes, Mother." Margaret halted. She appeared almost vulnerable. "Did you hear anything last night?" Evelyn's head tilted. "Hear what?" Margaret held her coffee cup tightly with her fingers. A voice. Evelyn made an innocent blink. "No, Mother. Maybe it was just in your head." Margaret nodded slowly, but her eyes were filled with skepticism. Evelyn grinned. It was underway. The real fun started that night. When the first knock came, Margaret was in her study. Gentle. Intentional. "It's just loud enough to hear." She paused. "Who's there?" she exclaimed. "Quiet." Then there came another knock. She opened it. Nothing. Nobody. Nobody was in the hallway. Evelyn reached for her mother's hand for the first time in years. She did not respond. "Who wrote this?" "It's blank, Margaret." Chapter 5. The Hallway's Shadows. Margaret Carter was always a dominant woman. She was unwavering, calculative, and frigid. However, something was changing. Something was falling apart. The small things came first. A glass that has been lost. A chair drew back slightly. The lights along the corridor flickered. Margaret brushed them off. Coincidences. Strange noises, sinking timber, and drafts creeping through the cracks had long been a feature of the old house. Then the murmuring began. At first, the sound was faint and difficult to perceive. There was a murmur in the darkness, like the wind sighing along the hallways. She could hear it as clearly as day one night. You should have never let her live. Her heart pounding, she spun around. The corridor is deserted. Quiet. The wine glass she was holding rattled. This wasn't what she had expected. It was difficult to shake Margaret. She did, however, secure the door to her bedroom that night. The servants muttered behind her back the next morning. "Mrs. Carter looks pale. She barely touched her breakfast." "Did you notice her hands?" They trembled. Margaret listened. She clenched her jaw. She refused to tolerate weakness. But she sensed it again as she climbed the ornate staircase. The oppressive presence. Slowly, she turned her head. There was a shadow at the end of the hallway. It had no characteristics, only a shape, a tall, terrifying thing that stood still. She demanded, "Who's there?" No response. She blinked. It had disappeared. Margaret tightened her grip on the staircase railing. She deceived herself. That was all. She needed to sleep. She required quiet. She left all of the lights on that night. However, something moved in the corner of her eye as she lay in bed. A number? It was closer this time. She was standing directly outside the door of her bedroom. The door was locked. It did not matter, however, because the handle turned slowly and purposefully while she watched. Margaret jumped out of bed. "Who's there?" "Quiet." Next, knock. Knock, knock. 3 rhythmic and gentle taps on the wood. Margaret gasped frantically for air. The residence was supposed to be empty. She grabbed her only weapon, the nightstand lamp, and moved toward the door. She gripped the handle, her fingers trembling. She pulled it open. Nothing. The corridor stands alone. However, she eventually noticed it. In the doorway, there was a single page from her old diary. Evelyn had found the diary. Margaret's heart froze. She read the words she had written decades ago and stooped to pick up the paper. "We never intended for her to exist. Grandma was right. She will ruin me if I let her stay." Behind her, there was a rapid exhalation. The cool air touched the back of her neck. Margaret peered around, but saw no one. The next morning, she was no longer the person she once was. She has black circles under her eyes. Twitching hands. Evelyn closely monitored her during breakfast. "You're not looking well, Mother." Evelyn speaks in a pleasant, quiet voice. Too quiet. Margaret's jaw constricted. "Don't be ridiculous." Her fingers shook so violently when she reached for her teacup that it fell and broke against the ground. There was stillness in the room. The servants stared. Walter fixed his gaze. Even Luna, the youngest, looked on in eerie silence. Margaret sensed it. A loss of command. She was under observation for the first time in her life. It was she who faced the judgment. What is the worst? She had no idea what or who was observing her. It became more intense the following evening. The creaking of her closet door woke her up. Not all at once. Not in a violent manner. Simply go slowly. Intentional. Margaret held her breath. Something moved inside the closet. There was a breath. Then, only one murmur. Next to her ear. "Do you believe me now?" She screamed. She took off running. She continued to run until she reached Evelyn's former bedroom. She closed the door firmly. She gasped, taking short breaths. She turned around. And stopped. For there, on that old, dusty dresser, it was her old journal. She revealed the page she had read the previous evening. And below her ancient handwriting, it was a brand new line. Fresh black ink was used to write. But she did not write it. Evelyn did not own it either. It simply said, "Now it's your turn." Margaret's hands gripped her head as she dropped to her knees. The murmurs increased in volume. The darkness grew closer. Additionally, she had never in her life. Margaret Carter was familiar with the sense of helplessness. Chapter 6. The Curse of the Grandmother. Margaret Carter has always taken pride in her ability to control situations. She was responsible for her family, her reputation, and every element of the Carter legacy. What about now? Even her thoughts were out of control. 3 days before, the rumors had started. She initially thought it was the wind blowing past the mansion's ancient walls. On the second night, however, she heard a voice, familiar, cold, and soft. "You let it happen, Margaret." Her heart raced as she sat up in bed. The voice came from beyond her door, in a poorly lighted hallway. Her fingers trembling, she turned on the lamp. The light illuminated her surroundings. However, the passage beyond remained dark. She resisted the need to breathe. She was merely misled by her own thoughts. It must have been. Day 4, the cold area. Margaret descended the grand staircase this morning, exhausted but determined. She had to regain control. She froze when she walked into the dining room. She had already pulled out her seat at the head of the table, as if someone had been sitting there all along. The air around the chair seemed strange, something she hadn't noticed previously. Colder. Margaret took a big breath. For the day, the servants had been released. There was no one else in the house. Her hand shook when she touched the chair. It was frigid. She was reminded of the last time she saw her own mother sitting there, accusatory and lifeless, staring at her. Margaret removed her hand. She refused to succumb to dread. Unlike her father, she refused to succumb to weakness. She turned and walked out of the room. She did, however, sense that someone was watching her as she walked away. The hallway figure on day 5. That night, Margaret was awakened by the sound of gentle footfall outside her door. She tried to listen while holding her breath. The footsteps ceased. There was silence for a minute. Then, the handle on the door twisted. Margaret's heart froze. She grabbed the lamp next the bed and turned it on. When the light came in, all she could see was the solitude in her bedroom. However, directly outside the entryway, there was a person at the end of the hall. Tall and still, observing. Margaret's breath became strained. She could barely form the words, so she murmured, "Who's there?" No response. She gave one blink. The figure was also closer. Her pulse was racing as she gasped and stumbled backward on the bed. Then she blinked one more. It had disappeared. Day 6. The disclosure. Margaret had spent the entire day inside her room. She barely moved or ate. There was something here. She wanted to remember something. A knock on the door came at dusk. She almost screamed. But it was Evelyn who opened it. Her daughter stood there, arms folded, eyes melancholy. "You look pale, Mother." Margaret's jaw constricted. She refused to be weak. She demanded, "What do you want?" Evelyn entered gradually. There was something in her hand. A letter. Margaret's gut contracted. "Where did you get that?" Evelyn stayed mute. She simply laid the letter down on the bedside table. Margaret hesitated before picking it up. There was no mistaking the handwriting. It had belonged to her mother. She opened it with trembling hands. "If you are reading this, Margaret, that means I have been unable to break the cycle. But you still have time. It needs to be done. As I should have done to you, she must be removed before she takes everything away from you." Margaret gave a gasp. Did her mother mean to discard her? She had now sought to injure Evelyn in a similar manner. History repeats itself. The words burned like fire in her mind. She turned to face Evelyn. Her daughter smiled. However, it was not a kind smile. It was a victorious smile. The walls were closing in on Margaret. The warning from her mother. Evelyn's unshakable confidence, her frosty manner around the house. Everything fell into place. Margaret had never been in control. Not at all. Day 7. The last decline. The next morning, the housekeeper discovered Margaret hunched in Evelyn's childhood bedroom, mumbling to the walls. She had empty eyes. She repeatedly said the same thing. "She's returned. She's back." They drove her away in an unmarked vehicle, locking her in a psychiatric clinic where she would never have authority over anyone again. As Evelyn looked from the doorway, she heard a voice speak in her ear. "Good girl. Now it is your turn." She turned sharply. No one was present. Or was there? The final twist, 650 words, in Chapter 7. That night, the air was thick with an uncanny stillness, and the Carter estate appeared eerily still. The elegant dining table, which had once been the center of family gatherings, was now covered with dust. The once vibrant house had lost its soul, much like the queen who had once ruled over it. Margaret Carter was no longer present. She was immersed in her own thoughts, yet she was still alive. After a week of psychotic episodes, the doctors determined she was not fit to live alone. After being confined to a mental health facility, she spent her days rocking back and forth and moaning against the walls. "She's watching me," she said. She never left. Her once perfect hair had become wild and untidy. A medical bracelet had taken the place of her magnificent jewelry. What about her great reputation? Broken into bits. Everything was lost for her. Evelyn Carter too? She had prevailed. Or so she thought. Starting with the nightmare. Evelyn hadn't seen her mother in exactly 3 months. Now life was supposed to be better. Walter had finally moved away from Margaret to a new place. Evelyn had fled the cold shadows of the Carter estate and returned to her own home. But something felt wrong. 2 weeks ago, the nightmares started. They began as minor occurrences, like footsteps in the hallway when she was alone at home or the sound of mumbling in the walls. Then things worsened. She had a dream every night about a woman watching her from the foot of her bed. Not Margaret. Another human. The image depicts an elderly woman with shadows covering her face. But what about the worst part? She generally whispered the same phrases. The cycle is never broken. Evelyn woke up sweating intensely and fighting to breathe. She persuaded herself, it's just stress. It is finished. It's finished. In her heart, she wasn't sure. Luna's cautions. Evelyn was sitting in the dark living room one evening when a small voice broke the silence. Mom? When Evelyn looked around, she noticed Luna clutching her toy rabbit at the doorway. She extended her arms and inquired, Sweetheart, what's wrong? Luna halted. I had a bad dream. Evelyn sighed as she patted the couch. Come here, tell me about it. Luna climbed into her mother's lap, holding Evelyn's sweater in her small fingers. Luna whispered, there was a woman. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She looked like you, but she was older. In addition, she was staring at me while standing in the corridor. Evelyn hugged Luna closely. It's just a dream, baby. Luna made a head shake. No, Mom. It was authentic. She also murmured something to me. Evelyn took a big breath. What did she say? Luna's voice was barely audible by this point. She said, one day, it will be my turn. Whispers in the walls. Evelyn barely slept that night. At 3:12 a.m., a creaking noise outside her bedroom woke her up. She held her breath. Steps. Deliberate, slow, and mild. You thought you were free? No response. What is the curse, Mother? What are you talking about? It was never about me, darling. Family should be the source of love and affection, but it can also leave the deepest scars. The lesson from Evelyn Carter's story is that the past never truly disappears. Rather, it continues to impact our present and future. If not addressed, generational trauma can be passed down from one generation to the next, much like a plague we never intended to receive. But what is the most potent lesson? We can break the cycle. Evelyn thought she was safe from her mother's harshness, but she quickly realized that evil always finds a way to resurface. Confronting the past and choosing to heal rather than hurt is the route to true freedom, not seeking vengeance or remaining mute. Family neglect or deceit does not mean that children will repeat their parents' mistakes. You can choose to change the story or listen to the whispers of the past.